She texted her sister at 2:47 in the morning. 3 messages. Sent them before she could talk herself out of it. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm sitting in my car outside the apartment. I'm scared of myself tonight. Sis, please answer. Message failed. Wrong number. She stared at the red notification like it had just confirmed something she already knew. Even that small reach for help had gone nowhere. She was parked 20 feet from her own front door, and she might as well have been on the other side of the world. Her name was Adeline Carlson. She was 29 years old. She had a finance degree she no longer used, a savings account she no longer trusted, and a marriage that had been dismantling her so slowly and so quietly that some days she woke up and couldn't remember what she'd been before it started. She was wearing the gray hoodie she'd grabbed on her way out, not because she'd planned to leave, she never planned to leave, but because she'd opened the front door for air, and her body just kept walking until she was in the driver's seat with her phone in her hands and no memory of making that decision. She had been sitting here for 47 minutes. The rain on the windshield made everything outside look like it was dissolving. Seoul at 3 a.m. The street below her apartment building still glowing amber and red from the restaurants that never fully closed. The neon of a convenience store 2 blocks down cutting through the dark like a scar. Beautiful city. She'd thought so when she first arrived, 3 years ago, following Paul's promotion, telling herself this was the next chapter. Now the lights just looked like a language she'd never learned to read. She couldn't go back inside. That was the only clear thing. Not because Paul would hurt her. He never hurt her. Not the way people meant when they said that. What he would do was worse in some ways and invisible in all the ways that mattered. He would sit in the kitchen with his coffee and his calm voice, and he would explain patiently exactly what she'd done wrong today. How she'd made things harder, how she embarrassed him, how she didn't understand the sacrifices he made, how lucky she was. He would say it all without raising his voice. He would say it until she heard herself apologizing and couldn't remember why. He would say it until she disappeared again, piece by piece, into the version of Adeline Carlson that Paul Carlson had decided to keep. She knew how it would end. It always ended the same way. She would go back inside and she would be smaller tomorrow than she was tonight. She looked down at her phone. The failed message was still on the screen. She pressed send again, to the wrong number, to nowhere, because she was that desperate, and the rain was that loud, and the alternative was silence. She didn't expect anything back. 3:02 a.m. Unknown number. I don't know who you meant to reach, but I'm here. Tell me what's happening. Adeline's thumb hovered over the screen. Her first thought was that this was wrong. Some stranger, some mistake, she should apologize and close the app. Her second thought arrived before she could act on the first. Who is this? She typed. 3 dots. Then, someone who isn't going anywhere tonight. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. She looked up through the rain-blurred windshield at the street that had no answers and the apartment building that had the wrong ones. Then she looked back down at the gray bubble on her screen, 40 floors above her, in a glass office that overlooked the whole city like a man who'd bought the view and stopped seeing it. Wang So read her reply and set his phone flat on the desk. The Seoul N Tower was burning blue in the distance. He had been in this office since 6 o'clock yesterday morning. His team had gone home by 10. His assistant had left at midnight. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 5. This was his life, enormous, empty, efficient, and he had never once thought to call it lonely, because calling it something meant feeling it. His phone lit up again. I sent it to the wrong number. I'm sorry to bother you. He picked it up. You're not bothering me, he typed. What were you trying to say? He wasn't sure why he asked. He told himself it was because the messages had been direct and specific, in the way that people in real trouble were direct and specific. He told himself he was simply responding to a situation with appropriate attention. He told himself a great many things in the 30 seconds before her next message arrived. That I don't know how much longer I can do this, whatever this is. Wang So looked at the city below him, at the rain coming down in sheets across the Han River Bridge, at the taillights of the last buses moving through streets that looked From this height, like a circuit board lit from underneath, he had built an empire in this city. He could call the governor. He sat on the boards of 4 institutions. He had not sent a personal text to anyone who wasn't his lawyer in 11 months. "Tell me," he typed. And she did. Not everything, not yet. She told him she was sitting in a car in the rain because she couldn't make herself go back inside. She told him she'd tried to reach her sister, and her sister hadn't answered. She told him she didn't have anyone to call, not in the way that meant she was unloved, but in the way that meant she'd let herself be cut off from the people who would have come. Slowly enough that she hadn't noticed until tonight, sitting here with the rain coming down, watching her own message fail, she didn't tell him about Paul. Not his name, not the savings account. She hadn't checked in 3 weeks because she was afraid of what she'd find. Not the way he'd looked at her this evening. That patient, calculating look that meant he was already constructing the version of tonight's events that would become the official record. But she told him enough. And he listened in the way that people listen when they have nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. At 5:10 in the morning, she typed, "I should go inside, thank you for staying. Text me when you're safe," he said. She almost didn't. She sat with her hand on the door for a full minute, watching the apartment building and deciding whether to trust a stranger's words or her own. Instinct about what waited inside. Then she went up, made it through the door, past Paul still asleep, into the bathroom where she ran the tap and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She picked up her phone. "I'm inside," she sent to the unknown number. The reply came in under a minute. "Good. Get some sleep." She sat on the edge of the bathtub in her gray hoodie and her exhaustion, and something she hadn't felt in long enough that she almost didn't recognize it. The simple, specific relief of being heard by someone who had nothing to gain from it. She didn't know his name. He hadn't offered it. She hadn't asked. She told herself it was nothing. It was 3 a.m. and she'd been in crisis, since strangers were kind sometimes, and that was all this was. She told herself she wouldn't text again. She was wrong. What happened next, and what Wang So didn't tell her about that first conversation, would change everything. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and know just how far our story is reaching. 40 floors above the street where Adeline's car was parked, Wang So was still at his window when she finally went inside. He stood the way he always stood at this hour. Weight shifted slightly to one side. Jacket off, but everything else still in place. The posture of a man who had been working for 21 hours and had simply decided not to acknowledge it. The rain was beginning to ease. He could see the individual drops on the floor-to-ceiling glass now, running in tracks rather than sheeting, which meant the worst of it was over. The city below had thinned to the essential. Delivery bikes, the last buses, a pair of taxis moving through intersections that were otherwise empty. He liked this hour. He never admitted that to anyone, not because it was a secret, but because there was no one to admit it to. His phone sat on the desk where he'd left it after her final message. "I'm inside," she'd said. "Good. Get some sleep," he'd replied. He had looked at that exchange for a moment after it ended, at the timestamps, the 2 hours and 8 minutes of conversation. The specific, careful way she had described her life without naming the person at the center of it. She had been precise about the edges of things and vague about the middle, which was what people did when they were protecting themselves from the full weight of their own situation. He had a comprehensive memory. It was one of the things that had made him effective in business and had made almost everything else more difficult. He retained conversations with the fidelity of a recording, not just the words but the pauses, the places where someone had started to say something and redirected, the particular quality of what people chose not to say. She had not told him the name. She had not told him why she was afraid to go back inside. She had told him she'd lost herself somewhere in the past 2 years and couldn't quite locate where the loss had begun. And she'd said it with the tone of someone reporting a fact that had stopped being surprising. He had told her to get some sleep. He did not sleep by himself for another hour. He sat at the desk and looked at the city and thought about a woman in a gray hoodie, in a car, and the Rain, who had been too alone to have anyone to call. And he thought about this in the way he thought about most things, with the part of his mind that was always, regardless of what else was happening, working the problem. He went home at 6 a.m. He had a car waiting, as always. His apartment was 12 minutes from the office. He had chosen it specifically for this reason 3 years ago, when he had still been telling himself that the apartment was a temporary condition, and he would eventually have reasons to need to be somewhere other than the office. He no longer told himself this. He simply kept the 12-minute car and appreciated the efficiency. He thought about her on the drive home. He thought, she will not text again. She will tell herself it was nothing, and she will believe it for approximately 1 day, and then she will text again, because people who have been starved of honest conversation did not give it up easily the first time they had it. He thought this without arrogance, not as a prediction based on his own appeal, but as an observation about human need, which was something he understood from a distance the way he understood most things about people. He was right. She texted at 7:12 the following evening. He was in a board meeting when it arrived. He looked at his phone under the table, something he never did, something his assistant had given up reminding him not to do because Wang So doing anything was Wang So having decided to do it. And he read, "I made it through today," he replied within 4 minutes. "I know, I've been wondering." He put the phone away and returned his attention to the quarterly projections, but some part of him, the part that had been standing at the window at 5 a.m. watching the rain ease, was already somewhere else. She went to sleep that morning the way people sleep after a crisis has passed and nothing has been resolved. Deeply, suddenly, like falling off a ledge into water she hadn't known was there. When she woke, it was past 9 and the apartment was full of pale, washed light, and Paul was already gone, and the rain had stopped, and Seoul was performing its ordinary morning beyond the windows as though nothing had shifted in the night. As though she hadn't sat in a car for 47 minutes in the dark, texting a stranger, because she had run clean out of other options. She lay still for a moment. She did the inventory she had trained herself to do every morning. The assessment of conditions, the reading of atmosphere, the calculation of what the day required, what day it was, what Paul's schedule looked like, what version of herself she would need to be by the time he came home. It had started unconsciously, this ritual, sometime in the 2nd year, and she had only recently recognized it for what it was. The behavior of a person who had learned that mornings held information she needed before she could move safely through the rest of the day. Then she remembered. The car, the rain on the windshield is like white noise. The message failed in red. The gray bubble arriving at 3 in the morning from nowhere. "I don't know who you meant to reach, but I'm here." She pressed her eyes shut. She opened them again. The ceiling was still there. She got up. The kitchen was clean in the way Paul liked it. Surfaces cleared. Everything returned to its designated place. The kind of order that looked like care and functioned more like control. He had left coffee in the travel mug, which was a gesture that would have read as thoughtful to anyone observing from outside, and which she had stopped being able to read as anything except its own kind of performance. She drank it standing at the counter and moved through the kitchen and thought about how long it took to stop, being able to distinguish thoughtfulness from the management of its appearance. She spent the morning like a ghost cataloging a house she was uncertain she still lived in. Laundry, folded and hung with the careful attention she gave to tasks that required no actual thought, leaving her mind free to run its parallel commentary on everything else. She answered an email from Bintu, her former colleague, 3 years into building her own consultancy, sending updates that were cheerful in the specific way of a person who wanted you to know they had chosen correctly. Adeline read it and replied with appropriate warmth, and felt underneath the warmth the particular, quiet ache of someone looking at the life they didn't take from a distance too far to measure. She watered the plant on the windowsill. She'd bought it from a market stall in Mapo 2 years ago, on one of the long Saturday walks she used to take before Paul had started asking where she'd been and how long filling the returns home with questions that were not quite interrogations, but performed the same function. The plant had survived. She'd expected it to die. She'd expected herself to let it. She didn't touch her phone until noon. When she finally did, she opened the conversation with the unknown number and read through it from the beginning. Slowly, the way you reread something you're not entirely convinced was real. The stranger had stayed for over 2 hours. He had asked questions with a precision that strangers had no business having. He had not tried to fix her or redirect her or perform concern in the self-uncongratulatory way that people sometimes perform concern, making the comforting of you about the evidence of their own decency. He had just stayed and listened. She closed the app. She told herself it was nothing. She had been in crisis, and the world contained decent strangers, and she had accidentally reached one, and that was the whole of it. She was not going to text a wrong number a second time. That would be a choice, and she was not making that choice. She made lunch. She ate it standing at the counter, which she always did. Sitting down felt like committing to the hour, which required believing the hour was worth committing to, which required a fundamental orientation toward her own days that she had gradually, without deciding to, abandoned. At 7:12 in the evening, she picked up her phone and typed, "I made it through today." She sent it before she could argue herself out of it. Then she put the phone face down on the counter and went to check whether the laundry was dry, because she needed something to do with her hands. She was pulling a shirt off the rack when she heard the buzz. She made herself finish what she was doing first. She folded the shirt. She hung 2 more things. She told herself that whatever the screen said was nothing. She had already established that. She was simply checking for completeness. Then she walked back to the counter and turned the phone over. "I know. I've been wondering." She stood in the kitchen of the apartment that had not felt like hers in over a year, and she read those 4 words, and something in her chest shifted. The way load-bearing things shifted when the pressure that had been holding them compressed was quietly, suddenly removed. A slow interior release, the kind you had to give yourself a moment to become aware of because you had forgotten what its absence felt like. He had been wondering. A stranger she had texted by accident, who had no name and no face and no reason to think about her past the moment the conversation ended, had been wondering about her through his day. "You've been wondering about someone you don't know," she typed back. "I have a high-capacity week and a low-capacity personal life," he replied. There was room. She almost smiled. She felt the reflex arrive before she could manage it, and then she let it. Let her face do the thing it was doing, in the empty kitchen. With no audience, the smile was hers. She was keeping it. She sat down at the counter. She did not stand. She sat and put her elbows on the surface, and read the message again, and sat with the feeling it produced, because the feeling was real, and it had been a long time since she had let real. Things have their full duration without cutting them short. That was how it started. Not with a decision, not with a moment she could point to and call the beginning. It started with a woman sitting down instead of standing, in a kitchen at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, almost smiling, staying. Over the next week, the conversations built themselves around her evenings without her quite choosing to allow them. They happened at different times. Sometimes at 9 when Paul was in his office on a call, sometimes past midnight when the apartment had gone fully quiet and she was in the bathroom with the tap running, once at 6 a.m. when she'd woken too early and the day hadn't committed to itself yet. She didn't track the pattern consciously until it was already there, and by then she didn't want to interrupt it. They talked the way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. Not in the polished, socially calibrated way she talked to Paul or the few acquaintances she still maintained, performing the version of Adeline Carlson that was permitted to exist in those contexts. They talked specifically. She told him about her work, not the vague past tense summary she gave at dinner parties. "Oh, I was in finance, mergers and acquisitions. It wasn't for me." But the actual work, the architecture of it. She told him about a valuation model she'd built in her second year, a methodology for weighting regulatory risk in over-leveraged acquisition targets that her entire team had called too conservative, that the client had pushed back against, that the market had validated within 18 months. She described the logic of it. She used technical language without apologizing for it. He asked about the weighting methodology, with a precision that stopped her mid-sentence. "Are you in finance?" she asked. "Adjacent," he said. "Keep going." She kept going. She talked with her hands. She noticed this and didn't stop, because she talked with her hands when she was genuinely engaged. And she was genuinely engaged, and it had been long enough that she'd forgotten the physical symptom of it. She talked about the satisfaction of finding the truth buried in data, about the particular pleasure of being correct when the room had decided she was wrong, about the moment a model resolved, that specific cognitive sensation of pieces clicking into alignment, the shape holding, the truth visible. He said, "That's when it feels like something worth doing," she said. "Yes, exactly that." He asked questions the way good analysts asked questions. Not to collect information, but to understand the structure of her reasoning, the method behind the conclusion. He was interested in how she arrived, not just where she landed. She found herself saying things she had only previously admitted in a wordless way. Thoughts existed when she was driving alone or standing in the shower, the things you knew without ever making them into sentences. He never pushed. He never offered opinions she hadn't solicited. When she said something with edges, something true and costly to say, he received it without flinching and without rushing to smooth it over, and came back with a question that went one layer deeper. It was more sustaining than reassurance. It was the difference between being comforted and being known. She still didn't know his name. She understood without fully articulating it that not knowing was part of what made honesty possible. He existed outside her life. He had no version of Adeline Carlson built from 2 years inside this apartment, no prior image to map her words onto. On the screen at midnight, she was just a person, specific and whole and unedited. She hadn't been that in a long time. Paul noticed she was on her phone more. She felt him noticing that quality of attention he had, quiet and accumulative, never announcing itself, gathering data the way a man who had never needed to rush a decision gathered data. He said nothing yet. He was waiting until he had enough to say everything at once. 2 weeks in, something shifted. She was telling him about a side street behind Insadong, a narrow alley that existed to reward people who walked without a destination, which she had done sometimes in the first year before Paul had made her long solitary walks a subject of questions she couldn't answer without accounting for more of herself than she was willing to account for. There was a pojang matcha at the end of it, run by a woman who had to be in her 70s, who made dokbaki the way Adeline imagined grandmothers cooked, not from a recipe but from accumulated knowledge, from doing something long enough that the proportions lived in the hands. She'd found it on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago when she'd taken a long walk to delay going home, and she'd sat at one of the plastic stools and eaten alone, and felt for 45 minutes genuinely located in her own life, like she was a person with coordinates, like she existed somewhere specific. She described it with full attention, the smell of the broth, the way the elderly woman had looked at her with the comfortable indifference of someone who had been feeding people for 50 years and found them all more or less equivalent in their hunger. The light in the alley in the late October afternoon, everything turned amber and specific. When she finished, he said, "You see things carefully." Not a compliment, more precise than that. An observation about how her mind worked, the way she paid attention. She felt it land because it was accurate, and because accuracy about her was something she had stopped expecting from anyone in this life she was living. Paul had stopped seeing her in any particular way long ago. She had become a function in his understanding rather than a person, she thought. He doesn't know who I am. And then, arriving before she could stop it, do I want him to? She typed her name before she decided to. Adeline she sent. Then, after a breath that lasted longer than it should have, Adeline Carlson. The 3 dots appeared, then stopped, appeared again, stopped. The silence stretched long enough that she began composing the thought that she'd made a mistake. Names made things real in ways the unknown number hadn't been real, and she had just changed that permanently at Line Carlson. He wrote her name back to her, and then, after a pause she could feel through a screen. You gave a presentation 2 years ago. WSK Group's acquisition of Meridian Financial. You were the only analyst in the room who told the truth about the asset valuation. The air left her body. She read it again, then again. Her hands had gone still on the phone, the way hands went still when the mind was moving fast and needed every available resource for what it was. Doing you were there, she typed. Not a question. I was the one at the head of the table, he said. You never looked up long enough to see me. She had a complete memory of that room. 23 people in chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her own voice, steady through effort, outlining the valuation discrepancy. The over-leveraged properties, the undisclosed covenant breaches, the gap between the acquisition as sold and the acquisition as it actually was. She remembered the silence after she finished, the specific quality of it, the kind that communicated she had said something true that the room had decided was inconvenient. She remembered the man at the head of the table. She hadn't looked at him directly. Something in the room's hierarchy had directed her gaze toward the safe middle distance. But she'd been aware of him the way you were aware of certain presences without looking, while others shifted and exchanged glances, and her supervisor made the small, tight smile that meant we will discuss this and it will not be pleasant. The man at the head of the table had looked at her briefly, with an expression she hadn't been able to read, and then said, "Thank you," and moved the meeting forward. That had been Wang So. Did you know, she typed, making each word deliberate, when I first texted, did you know it was me? No, he said, not until you told me your name, and then? I knew the name when you told me, he said. I let you tell me everything anyway, because I needed you to choose. Not to be maneuvered, to choose. There's a difference, and it was the only version I wanted. I'll understand if you're angry, he added. I'm not going to apologize for waiting, but I will understand it. She sat with that. She was angry, briefly, the specific, cooler kind that arrived with clarity rather than heat, the kind that came from suddenly understanding the geometry of something she thought she'd already mapped. She had believed she was talking into a void, honest in the way she was only honest when no one who knew her was listening. And he had known. Not from the beginning she believed that. But for a week, perhaps more, he knew and kept listening. But then she sat with what he'd said. I needed you to choose. Every night she had. She had picked up the phone and made an active decision each time, with the full knowledge that she could stop. She had kept choosing. He hadn't manufactured that. He had only not interrupted it. I'm not angry, she typed. I'm recalibrating. Take your time, he said. Tell me your name, she said, the actual one, since we're doing this. Wang So, he replied, CEO of WSK Group. I believe I owe you a proper introduction and probably an explanation for why I was still in my office at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, which reflects poorly on my personal life, but accurately on my quarterly earnings. She laughed. Alone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, she laughed. A real one, unmanaged, arriving before she could decide whether to let it. She put her hand over her mouth and then took it away, because it was hers and she wasn't giving it back. He asked her to meet him 3 days later. The message was direct, which she'd come to expect. Coffee. You choose the place. Public, wherever you're comfortable. You can leave any time you need to. She noticed he had anticipated the concern before she raised it. He had built an exit into the invitation. She said yes. She chose a cafe near her old office district, a neighborhood she still moved through sometimes, drawn by something that wasn't quite nostalgia, more the reflex of visiting a part of yourself that had been closed off and that you weren't ready to officially declare inaccessible. Ground floor, full windows, visible from the street in every direction. She could see the entrance clearly from any table she chose. She arrived 14 minutes early, sat with her back to the wall and a clear sightline to the door, and ordered before he arrived, because having her coffee already in hand when he came in felt like something she needed, like a small, private act of preparedness. She had dressed carefully without admitting to herself that she was dressing carefully. She had opened the wardrobe that morning and moved past the things she usually reached for. The comfortable clothes, the nondescript clothes, the clothes of a woman who had stopped making choices about her appearance because choices required a self-image to make them from, and gone to the back, the structured blazer she hadn't worn in 2 years, the dark trousers she'd bought the week before she left her job, that week when she'd told herself she would keep wearing professional clothes because this was not the end of anything, just a pause, just a chapter break. She would return. She had not returned. The clothes still fit. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for longer than she usually allowed, and she thought, there you are, not as a greeting to herself, more as the recognition you made when something came back into view that you had stopped expecting to see, like finding a version of herself she had set down somewhere and quietly, without ceremony, stopped going back for. She was halfway through her coffee when he came through the door. He was not what she had built in her imagination, which surprised her because she had not realized she was building anything. She'd assembled a version of him from the texture of his language, the precision of his attention, the particular quality of his silences, and the man who walked into the cafe was consistent with all of that and entirely different from it in person. The difference was physical presence, which you couldn't construct from text messages regardless of how precise the text was. He was tall. She'd expected that from something about the way he occupied a sentence. Slim. A dark suit that communicated money the way good suits did, not by demanding you notice it, but by simply being exact, every element without excess. No tie, the collar open one button, which was, she thought, the adjustment of a man who could have been fully formal and had chosen not to be, which was itself a kind of confidence. He moved without urgency. This was the thing she hadn't been able to anticipate, not the performed slowness of a man demonstrating his own importance. She'd seen that plenty, in meeting rooms, in men who had decided that moving unhurriedly was the signal of power, the deliberate theater of it. This was different. This was the genuine quality of someone who had stopped measuring his worth by how busy he appeared. He moved through the cafe like a man who had nowhere more important to be than wherever he was, and she recognized the quality not as arrogance, but as a specific kind of peace she hadn't expected from a person who ran an empire. He found her immediately. The cafe had 40-odd people in it at various tables, and he walked in and looked once and found her. She felt the accuracy of that. It told her he had paid attention to the kind of person she was, had made a prediction about where she'd be sitting, and had been correct. She spent a moment deciding whether to find this comforting or unsettling, and concluded it was both and that both were acceptable. He sat down across from her. She waited for the version of him that existed in public, the CEO surface, the polished management of the impression that men in his position generally deployed when the situation was unfamiliar or required something from them. She had prepared for that version. She had prepared responses that would work with that version. He said, "You picked a good cafe." Just that. A plain observation offered without performance. She had picked a good cafe. He was noting it the way you noted things that were simply true. "I know the neighborhood," she said. He nodded, asked if the coffee was good. She said it was. He ordered the same from the server who appeared at his elbow, and somehow by the time the server had gone, the strange suspended moment of meeting someone who was already partly known had resolved itself quietly into just two people at a table, in the ordinary light of a Tuesday afternoon. The strangeness of it, the weeks of midnight conversations, the name revealed 2 days ago, the specific asymmetry of a meeting where one person already knew far more about the other than they had been introduced to, had not disappeared. It had simply settled into the background, present but not governing, the way the awareness of a thing became manageable once you were inside it. They talked for 3 hours. She couldn't have reconstructed the full arc of it afterward. It moved the way conversations moved when two people had already established something through other means, skipping the introductory stages that were usually necessary, landing in the middle of things that actually mattered. He asked about her work, and she talked about it in the detailed, technical way she'd only recently relearned she was allowed to use with another person. She described the meridian analysis, the over-leveraged property portfolio, the covenant structure she'd identified as a latent liability, the gap between the acquisition as modeled and the acquisition as it would perform under moderate market stress. She described it precisely. She watched his face while she talked and saw, in the quality of his listening, that he already knew the outcome. He had been in the room. He had watched her analysis prove correct within 18 months of the meeting, where it had been received as inconveniently pessimistic. She asked him directly whether he would have done the acquisition differently. He was quiet for a moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. There was a difference she'd become attuned to. "We restructured the terms 3 months after your presentation," he said. "The covenant breach provisions you flagged. We added safeguards that weren't in the original agreement." She stared at him. "Your team told my team the model was too conservative. My team told your team that," he agreed. "I told my legal department something different." She sat with this. He had heard her in that room. He had let the room respond the way the room was going to respond, because that was what the room needed to do, and then he had done something else. The thing she'd recommended, in the only language that mattered, which was action. He had not defended her analysis in the meeting. He had implemented it afterward, without fanfare, without acknowledgement, because the implementation was the point and the credit was secondary. He had listened, even then. 2 years ago, before any of this, he had heard her tell the truth into a room that wanted a more comfortable version of it, and he had acted on it. She talked with her hands. She noticed this at some point and let it continue, because she talked with her hands when she was genuinely absorbed. And she was absorbed in a way she had forgotten was still available to her. The particular unself-consciousness of caring too much about what you were saying to monitor how you were saying it. She had spent 2 years in the managed performance of herself. This was not that. This was something she'd had to recover from somewhere back in her history. From before the marriage, from before the gradual and systematic reduction of her professional self to something Paul found less inconvenient. He asked about the career she'd left. No pity in the question. She'd anticipated pity, the sympathetic lean forward, the what a waste implicit in the tone of people who treated her departed career as a tragedy, primarily because it inconvenienced their sense of the world's fairness. He asked it the way he asked everything, because the answer would tell him something he wanted to know. "I left to focus on our life together," she said. She said it the way it had been said to her, the exact phrasing Paul had offered, and she had eventually adopted the syntax of something that sounded like a choice and functioned like a sentence. He made it easier to leave than to stay, Wang So said. Not a question. She hadn't told him the mechanism. She had told him the shape of the absence, the dates, the career she no longer had, the professional world she'd been slowly separated from. She hadn't told him the specific, iterative process by which Paul had made her work a liability. The comments about her hours that were not quite criticisms, the observations about her distraction that were not quite accusations, the patient construction of a home environment in which her career accumulated costs that her salary couldn't justify, and her continued performance of a good wife couldn't survive. Wang Sowengens had read what she'd said around the thing and understood the thing itself. It was exactly what she had done in that meeting room 2 years ago, reading the data adjacent to the stated data, finding the truth that the presentation was trying not to say. She recognized the method. It was her own. "Yes," she said, just one word. He received it. He let it sit between them with the full weight it carried, without rushing to smooth it over or offer the comfort that would have been for his own benefit rather than hers. He didn't say you should leave. He didn't say I'm sorry. He said nothing, and nothing was exactly right. When the cafe began to fill with the early evening crowd and the light through the windows had shifted from afternoon to amber, they left. He walked beside her to the subway entrance 3 blocks away, and she was aware the entire 3 blocks of the distance he maintained. Enough to be, with her, not close enough to imply anything she hadn't offered. At the entrance, he stopped. "Same time next week?" She said yes before she decided to. She became aware of this on the train home, that her mouth had answered before her mind had been consulted, which meant her body had made the decision first, and her body made the decisions based on a different kind of knowing than the kind she usually ran on. She sat with that on the ride home and decided it was information worth keeping. She got home before Paul, changed out of the blazer, folded it carefully, returned it to the back of the closet, made dinner. When Paul came home, he kissed her cheek and said, "Thank you," and looked at his phone through most of the meal and asked about her day. And she said, "Quiet," and he nodded and looked back at his phone. And the evening performed itself around them in the way evenings had performed themselves for 2 years. She didn't think about Wang So while Paul was home. She thought about the blazer in the back of the closet and the model she'd built for the meridian analysis that had been dismissed and then implemented, and the way she'd talked with her hands for 3 hours without noticing. She thought about what it had felt like to remember, in the specific, embodied way of physical proof, that she was someone with things worth saying. She thought, "I am going to be all right." She thought it like a fact she was still in the process of verifying, not yet certain, but no longer impossible. And that was more than she'd had yesterday. That night, while Paul was in his office on a late call, she sat at the kitchen table. Sat, not stood, with her second cup of tea, and she let herself think about what was happening, without editing it down to something manageable. She was having coffee every week with Wang So. She was texting him almost every night. She knew the shape of her life with a specificity she had not managed to extend to anyone else in 2 years, and he had listened to it and asked questions that went deeper than any question Paul had asked her about anything in longer than she could clearly remember. She was not having an affair. She knew what she was having. A friendship with a man who paid attention to her. That was the plain fact of it, and the plain fact felt both completely innocent and completely destabilizing. Because the thing that should have been ordinary, being known by another person, had become, inside her marriage, an extraordinary thing, a prohibited thing, not prohibited by rule, prohibited by the slow erosion of a self that had stopped believing it was worth knowing. She thought about the Meridian presentation, about standing in that room at 27, in the first good suit she'd ever owned, and saying the true thing because she could not make herself say anything else. And the silence that followed, and the man at the head of the table, who had looked at her briefly with an expression she had categorized as unreadable, and then let the meeting move on. She had left that job 8 months later. She had spent 2 years telling herself that the career had been a sacrifice she'd chosen, and it had taken a stranger texting her at 3 a.m. from the wrong number to help her hear the story she had actually been living. She thought about what Wang So had said when she told him she'd left to focus on their life together. Not "I'm sorry," not "that's not right," just the accurate identification of the mechanism, said plainly, with no particular emotion. He made it easier to leave than to stay. She thought about the way that naming a thing correctly could do more than any amount of sympathy, about how she had spent 2 years inside a situation that had no correct name in the way Paul told it, and how different it felt to have the correct name. Not better exactly, not fixed, but solid in a way that the Paul version of the story was not solid, grounded in fact rather than maintained by the constant low-level effort of agreeing with a version of events she'd always known was wrong. She understood now, in a situation that required her to act. Not to react, not to wait for Paul's next move and then respond to it, not to manage the day-to-day performance of her own disappearance and hope that things resolved themselves eventually. She was in a situation that required her to decide what she wanted, and then to move toward it deliberately. With her eyes open, she had not decided anything yet. She was not ready to decide anything yet. But she was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with her second cup of tea, and she was thinking about herself as a person with a future that was not yet determined, and that was farther than she had gotten in a long time. Her phone lit up on the table. "Wang So." "You went quiet," he said. "Are you all right?" She looked at the message. She thought about the fact that he had noticed her silence. that he tracked the rhythm of their conversations closely enough to notice when she was in it. She thought about what that meant about the kind of attention he paid, and she let herself sit with what she felt about it instead of immediately translating it into something neutral. "I'm thinking," she typed back. "Good," he said. "What about?" "Myself," she said. "I'm thinking about myself." A pause. Then, "Also good. Tell me when you're done." She set the phone down and looked at the kitchen and looked at the window and looked at the dark city beyond it and thought, for a long time, about herself, about who she had been before this apartment and who she was inside it and who she might be if she let herself move toward the door that had been so quietly and so specifically left open for her. Outside, Seoul kept going. It always did. Beautiful, indifferent, enormous, full of people navigating their own versions of the night, their own calculations, their own small and enormous decisions about what to do next. She sat with herself in the kitchen and she thought, and she did not disappear. Paul found out on a Thursday. She knew something was wrong before she understood what. She had developed, over 2 years, the sensitivity of someone who had learned to read atmosphere the way others read weather. She felt it the moment he came through the door that Thursday. The quality of his movements, too deliberate, too smooth. The particular care of a man who had something and was deciding when to spend it. He was performing normalcy. Paul performing normalcy was more alarming than Paul not performing it. Because performance meant he was managing information. He'd seen the cafe charge on her bank statement. She assembled this later, in retrospect, piecing the sequence together from the parts she eventually gathered. A small charge on a Tuesday afternoon, a neighborhood she had no covered reason to visit. He had noticed it and said nothing, because Paul never said anything until he understood exactly what he was saying. And understanding exactly what he was saying required more. He had access to her carrier account, had had it for 22 months, added during a conversation she remembered as a practical discussion about shared plan costs. She had agreed. She hadn't read the full terms of what she was agreeing to, which was not naivety so much as the exhaustion of a woman who had spent so much energy managing every other landscape of her life that she'd stopped reading fine print. She hadn't known about the message logs. She hadn't known because he'd never needed to use them before. She had never, before 7 weeks ago, given him a reason to. He ran the unknown number. Within 48 hours he had the name, the photograph, the company, the biography, the net worth, all of it assembled with the methodical efficiency of a man who treated information the way other people treated weapons, gathered carefully, deployed at the moment of maximum effect. His reaction was not jealousy. She understood this about Paul. Jealousy would have implied fear of loss, and Paul did not operate from fear. He operated from the certainty of control, and when something moved outside that control, he felt not fear but the cold, purposeful drive of a man who had identified a variable he hadn't accounted for and was now engineering its correction. What he felt, she understood later, was something closer to offense. Not the offense of a man who believed his wife had betrayed him. He was not, at this stage, thinking in those terms. The offense of a man who had built a careful system and discovered that a component was behaving outside its parameters. The offense was not personal. It was structural, and structural problems, in Paul's understanding of the world, had structural solutions. He called Detective Robert Johnson from his office that afternoon, with the door closed and his voice low. She didn't know this yet. She only knew that Paul had become very quiet in a specific way, and that the apartment felt different when she came home. Not different in any way she could point to, nothing displaced or changed, but different in the way that air pressure changed before weather arrived. Something building in the atmosphere, something loading. She came home that Thursday to a version of him she recognized, performing domesticity with slightly too much precision, realigning things that were already aligned, the tell of a man who needed to keep his hands occupied while his mind worked. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He smiled, and the smiles had a seam, the small delay between impulse and expression that she'd learned to read in year 2, the one he couldn't entirely control no matter how careful he was. He asked about her week. Quiet, she said. He asked casually whether she'd been spending time in the old office district lately. Just conversation. Voice easy, unloaded. The tone he used when the surface of what he was saying was not the thing he meant, and the thing he meant was a question she was not being given directly, because being given it directly would tell her what he already knew. She said not really. He said, The evening continued on its surface, performing itself. Later, she would think about this dinner as the last one she'd had, without knowing the shape of what was coming. She had known something was wrong. She had not yet understood how wrong, how far along Paul's planning was. What he had already set in motion with a phone call that afternoon to a man who had made a career of making things disappear for people who needed things to disappear. She had known only the atmosphere, that charge in the air, that specific quality of Paul's calm, which was always most dangerous when it was most complete. She made it to the bathroom, locked the door, turned on the tap and sat on the edge of the tub and picked up her phone with hands that were steadier than she felt. "Something's wrong," she texted Wang So. "He knows something. I don't know what yet, but I can feel him deciding." The reply came in under 2 minutes. "Has he hurt you?" She looked at the question. She had been asked it before. Once by her sister, sideways over the phone, and once by a doctor who'd left the opening available and waited. She had answered the same way each time. The true way, the incomplete way. "Not the way you mean," she typed. A pause. Then, "Tell me what you need right now." Not, "Tell me what happened." Not, "Are you safe?" Not the questions that required her to assess damage she wasn't ready to quantify. Just, "What do you need, right now, in this moment?" She sat with it on the edge of the bathtub, with the tap running, and she actually thought about the question, seriously, the way it deserved, and she realized it was the first time in long enough that she had to search for the answer rather than reflexively deflect it. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know. She knew Paul had been collecting information. She knew he had the unknown number and likely had the name attached to it by now. She knew he was the kind of man who did not collect information passively, who collected it with a purpose, a deployment already in mind, a damage already being calculated. She did not know what shape that damage would take, and not knowing was the most dangerous condition she could be in, because you could not defend against something you couldn't see. "I need to know what he knows," she typed, "before he builds something out of it that I can't correct." "I'll find out," Wang So said. "In the meantime, don't let him see you looking." She turned off the tap, looked at herself in the mirror, bare face, hair down, no performance, and she looked like someone who had just understood something she had been circling for a long time, without looking at directly, not afraid. Something past fear, something that arrived when you stopped waiting for the situation to improve on its own and recognized that improvement would require you to be active inside it. She wasn't sure yet whether the understanding would save her or accelerate what she'd been afraid of. But she knew she was not navigating this alone anymore, and the knowledge of that was different from anything she'd had in 2 years, different in the way that mattered. She unlocked the bathroom door. She went back to the kitchen. She agreed with Paul about Saturday's restaurant and contributed enough words to the remainder of the evening that it resolved without incident. She kept her phone in her pocket and her face very still and her voice level, and underneath all of it she held, carefully, the knowledge that she had information Paul didn't know she had. She held it the way you held anything that was both fragile and potentially decisive, with attention, with care, without letting it show in how you moved. It was the first time in 2 years she had been the one, with information she hadn't been given permission to carry. She held it carefully, and she waited. Wang So had suggested it quietly, the way he suggested most things that mattered, not as advice, not as instruction, but as a question offered sideways, with space for her to arrive at her own answer. "When did you last look at your personal accounts?" he'd asked. 3 days after she'd told him about Paul's silence and the apartment's changed atmosphere. All of them, not just the ones you use regularly. She hadn't answered immediately. She'd looked at the question on her screen for a long moment and understood that he was telling her something, without telling her, giving her the thread, and trusting her to follow it. He knew she would follow it. He had read her well enough by now to know that she was, underneath everything Paul had layered on top of her, a person who followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of what she found at the end. She waited 2 more days before she could make herself do it, not because she didn't know how to check an account, because she was afraid of what she would find, and she needed 2 days to build herself into the kind of person who could look at the truth and remain standing. She had always needed to prepare herself for difficult information. This was something she'd known about herself since her first job. The internal readiness required before you opened the spreadsheet that was going to tell you. The thing nobody in the room wanted to hear. She had learned to build that readiness intentionally, like a structure you assembled, before you needed to stand inside it. On the 3rd morning after Wong So's question, she sat down at her laptop at the kitchen table, while Paul was at work, and opened the account she had, maintained separately, quietly, invisibly. The savings she had built across 3 years out of the margins Paul didn't monitor. Small transfers moved carefully between accounts in amounts too small to pattern, the kind of accumulation that required patience and a specific kind of hope. The hope that someday she might need it. The hope she had never let herself name directly, because naming it would have required admitting that she had been building an exit from the beginning, and she had not been ready to admit that to herself. She had been ready for longer than she'd acknowledged. The balance on the screen was $4,200. It should have been $38,000. She sat very still. The kitchen was quiet around her, the refrigerator hum, the distant traffic below the window, a pigeon on the ledge that arrived and left with total indifference to what was happening on the other side of the glass. She looked at the number. She looked at it the way you looked at something that required your eyes to confirm what your mind was already understanding, because the mind needed the confirmation, even though it had already arrived at the conclusion without help. $34,000. Gone in increments. Extracted across 14 months through a shell account she had never created, which meant someone had created it in her name, which meant someone had access she had not consented to, which meant this had been constructed deliberately and systematically over more than a year. While she had gone to sleep in the same bed as the man, doing it, and woken up every morning, and made coffee and performed a marriage and believed, at some level she understood now had never been entirely real, that she was choosing to stay. She had not been choosing to stay. She had been made unable to leave. There was a difference. She had always suspected the difference existed. Now she had $4, $200, and a 14-month transaction history that documented it in the kind of detail that left no room for another interpretation. She closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall and breathed deliberately, the way you breathed when you needed to stay functional inside something that wanted to make you stop. She did not text Wang So. Not yet. She needed to hold this for a moment before she gave it to anyone else, because once she said it out loud, it would become a story she was inside, rather than a fact she was holding. And she needed a little more time with the fact before the story started. She carried it through the rest of that day, and through the following evening with the care of someone transporting something both fragile and explosive. Paul came home. She made dinner. She spoke the necessary words and maintained the necessary expressions, exactly enough to fill the space without giving anything away. And underneath all of it, she held the knowledge that she finally had what she had been, building toward, not just the understanding of what was true, but the proof. The documented, time-stamped, forensically traceable proof that would not move or change or be subject to Paul's particular gift for making her doubt her own experience. That night she lay in the dark beside him and felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Not fear, not the anticipatory dread of the next managed evening. She felt clarity. The particular, clean-edged clarity of a person who has finally aligned what they know with what they can demonstrate, and who understands that the alignment changes everything. Not because it changes what is true, but because it changes what can be done about what is true. She called Steve the next morning. She called him from her office, which was the one place she could be certain was not monitored. She understood now that her apartment, the phone plan Paul managed, possibly her personal laptop, were compromised in ways she was still mapping and could not yet fully correct. Steve answered on the second ring. She said, "I need you to come to my office today. I need to tell you something." He didn't ask what. He said, "I'll be there in an hour." He was there in 40 minutes. He came through the door the way he always came through doors, without ceremony, without performance, simply present and fully present, taking in the room and the situation and her face with the quick, comprehensive read of someone who had known her for 29 years and understood, from a single glance, when something fundamental had shifted. He sat down across from her and waited. She told him everything, not the edited version, the full version, from the beginning, the car in the rain, the 47 minutes, the message failed in red, the gray bubble from an unknown number at 3:02 in the morning. 2 months of texts, Wang So. The cafe and the blazer and the name reveal, and the understanding that the wrong number had been, impossibly, his number. Paul's Thursday silence, which she had been right to read as information. The account. The $4,200 where $38,000 should have been. The 14-month transaction history. The shell account she had never opened. She told him everything, in sequence, with the specificity she had always brought to evidence that mattered. She showed him the transaction history on her phone. She watched his face while she talked. The way the information registered on it, the particular quality of his stillness, that she had known since childhood, as the stillness of a man who was deciding something he would not be, talked out of, deciding it quietly, so that the decision was made before anyone could introduce a reason against it. He did not interrupt. He did not react with the kind of emotion that would have required her to manage him on top of managing herself. He listened the way she needed someone to listen, as though the facts she was giving him mattered more than his feelings about the facts. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know about Wang So." She looked at him. He had reached out, he explained, 2 weeks earlier. He had been paying attention to the edges of what she'd shared across the past months, and the edges had told him enough to know something was happening, that he needed to understand from a perspective she wasn't giving him. He'd found a contact, a former colleague who consulted in WSK Group's orbit, and he'd made a call. Wang So had taken it personally. They had spoken for 40 minutes. Wang So had asked him one question directly without surrounding it with anything. Does your sister need to be saved, or does she need a door held open? Steve had thought about it before answering, which was how he answered everything that deserved thought. He had looked at what he knew of her. Not the version she managed for the world, but the version he had watched across 29 years, through all the phases and choices, and the specific way she'd always walked toward hard things rather than away from them, even when walking toward them cost her. He had answered honestly. She has never needed saving in her life. She needed someone to stop standing in the doorway. Adeline looked at her brother and felt something move through her that was too large and too layered to untangle into one feeling. Gratitude, grief, the specific complicated love of being known accurately by someone who had been paying attention long enough to get it right, even when she'd been trying to hide the picture. She had spent 2 years trying to protect Steve from the truth of her life, calibrating what she showed him, managing the version of the marriage he saw, keeping the worst of it contained within the apartment where it happened. And he had looked at the parts she'd let him see and understood the full shape of it anyway, because he was her brother and he had always known where to look. He's been waiting at exactly the distance you needed someone to wait, Steve said. Wang So. He said, if she asks for more, I'll be there. If she doesn't, I'll still be there, but I won't push the door. I'll just make sure it's open. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the distance traveled to get to this office, this conversation, this morning, the car, the rain, the wrong number, the man at the window 40 floors above a rain-soaked street who had looked at 3 texts from a stranger and decided to stay. She thought about the word open, about what it meant that someone had understood without being told that what she needed was not rescue, but space. Not a hand pulling her forward, but a door that wasn't blocked, she thought. He held it open from the beginning. He just didn't tell me that's what it was. She looked at Steve. I'm going to be okay, she said. I know, he said. You've been okay for a while. You just needed the proof. He was right, she had, and now she had it. Paul's plan went into motion on a Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., which was the hour he had calculated would cause maximum damage. Early enough to reach the business press before the markets opened, late enough that a response would be scrambling rather than prepared. 3 outlets ran the story simultaneously. Adeline Carlson, former financial analyst, had allegedly been feeding confidential WSK Group client data to CEO Wang So in exchange for undisclosed payments. 2 sources, both anonymous. Documents attached, financial transfer records, internal memos, a timeline of supposed communications that placed her inside WSK Group systems at specific dates and times. Adeline was in her office when the first call came. Her employer's HR department, which meant the story had already reached internal circulation before she'd had time to understand what she was looking at. She read the headline on her phone with the peculiar, distancing calm that arrived sometimes in moments of extreme crisis, when the mind went, briefly analytical as a protective measure, because analytical was survivable and feeling everything at once was not. She read the attached documents. She recognized them as fabrications within 90 seconds. Not because they were obviously false to an untrained eye. Paul had been careful. They were well constructed. But because she had spent years doing due diligence on financial documents, and she knew where fabrications broke down. The metadata inconsistencies, the timestamp anomalies, the specific formatting errors that appeared when someone built a document from a template rather than from an actual system. These were the errors of a person who was very careful but had never actually worked inside a corporate financial infrastructure and therefore didn't know what they didn't know. She recognized them. She felt, underneath the recognition, a cold fury that she kept very still. The second call was her employer's legal team. The third was a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be an immigration services inquiry. Her visa status flagged for review, pending the outcome of an active fraud investigation. This was the most precisely targeted element of the plan, and she understood it as such. Paul had found the one lever that didn't require a legal conviction, only an accusation. Her right to stay in Seoul was dependent on her employment. Her employment was dependent on her reputation. Her reputation was now in the process of being publicly destroyed. She sat in her office with her phone in both hands, and she looked at the 3 open calls on her screen, and she understood, with the specific clarity of a person who had finally seen the full architecture of something, that this had been built carefully. Paul had spent 3 months building this. He had identified every vulnerability, professional, legal, residential, and had coordinated them into a single action designed to hit simultaneously and leave her without footing in any direction. She called Wang So. He answered on the first ring. She said his name. Then she didn't say anything else, because she wasn't sure what the first sentence should be, and she needed him to give her a moment before she had to construct one. He gave her the moment. Then he said, I know. I've been watching it build for 4 days. She processed this. 4 days. I let it run, he said. His voice was entirely steady. Not performing steadiness, but actually steady. The way he was when he had moved past the crisis phase of a situation and was operating from what came after. I needed the complete picture before I moved. The full sourcing trail, all 3 outlets, the document metadata, the IP chain, the connection between Paul and Johnson. I needed everything, because I was moving once and it had to be complete. She understood the methodology. She had operated the same way in due diligence. You let the data accumulate before you committed to a conclusion, because a premature conclusion based on incomplete evidence was more dangerous than waiting. She understood it and still felt the cold of it. He had watched it being built while it was being built, and had not told her, because telling her would have changed the conditions. What does that mean, she said, the complete picture? It means it's over for him, Wang So said. He just doesn't know it yet. She looked at the 3 open calls on her screen. At the immigration inquiry that was the most precisely calibrated blow Paul had calculated. She thought about the version of this conversation where she fell apart, where the calls and the inquiry and the public fabrication combined into the disabling crisis Paul had designed them to produce. She thought about how she might have experienced this 3 months ago before a wrong number had given her back a container for honesty and the practice of saying the true thing to someone who received it accurately. She thought, I am not that person anymore. And then, carefully, I never was. I just forgot for a while. Tell me what to do right now, she said. Go to your office. Stay visible. Don't comment on any press inquiry. I'll handle the rest. She went to her office. She stayed. She watched her phone ring with numbers. She didn't answer, and she kept her face neutral and her posture level, and she waited. Because waiting was sometimes the most active thing available to you, and she had learned, across the months since 3 a.m. in a car in the rain, that she was capable of waiting at exactly the right distance from the thing she was waiting for. The press conference was at 11 that morning. She did not attend. He had told her not to, which she had understood as strategy rather than exclusion. Her presence would have made the story about her personal situation rather than about the evidence, and the evidence needed to be the story. She sat in her office with the door closed and her phone on the desk and watched it on her laptop, which was the strangest kind of witness position she had ever occupied. Watching a man she had trusted with the truth of her life stand at a podium and use that trust to dismantle the architecture of damage that had been built around her. Wang So stood at the podium the way he stood at his office window. Without urgency, without performance, with the quality of total attention he brought to everything that mattered. Behind him, 2 screens displayed the evidence in parallel sequence. Commissioner Grayson was seated to the right. The presence of the commissioner meant that the legal filings had already been submitted before the press conference was announced. Wang So had built the legal case before he made it public, which meant by the time journalists were asking questions, the questions had already been answered by the courts. This was, she understood, not coincidence. This was the specific, methodical sequencing of a man who had spent 4 days letting a fabrication run its course so that he could map its full infrastructure before dismantling it completely. He began with the documents. He walked through the forensic analysis with the same unhurried clarity he brought to everything presents evidence the way she had learned to present evidence in that meeting room 2 years ago, without embellishment, without the performance of outrage, simply. This is the data, this is what it shows, this is what it means. The timestamps on the leaked documents were internally inconsistent with WSK Group's actual document management system. The formatting matched a publicly available legal services template. The financial transfer records referenced account numbers that had never existed within WSK Group's banking infrastructure. None of it was real. All of it was traceable. Then he showed the originating IP address for all 3 outlet submissions. A single address, routing through a VPN purchased 11 days ago on a credit card registered to a shell company, the same shell company that had been used to drain Adeline Carlson's personal savings account across 14 months. Paul had used the same tool for both operations. The connection was not circumstantial. It was direct and documented, and it had left a trail that Wang So's investigators had followed all the way to its source. Then the internal affairs file on Detective Robert Johnson, 18 months of documented misuse of departmental resources, a pattern that the relevant oversight board had been legally obligated to disclose upon formal request. Wang So's team had filed the formal request. The board had disclosed. The file existed. It had existed before any of this. It had simply been waiting for someone to ask for it through the correct channels, and Wang So had asked. He presented all of it without raising his voice, without a single moment of visible anger or personal investment. It was evidence. It was documented. It was complete. And it would be filed simultaneously in 3 jurisdictions before the end of the business day. He was calm throughout. in the way that someone was calm when they had been right about something from the beginning and were simply allowing the record to demonstrate it. He closed with one sentence. Miss Carlson was the most honest person in a room full of people paid to agree with me, too. Years ago, I expect she will continue to be. She heard this from her office on her laptop and sat very still for a moment. She thought about the room 2 years ago. She thought about saying the true thing into a silence that wanted the comfortable version. She thought about how it had cost her, and how she had said it anyway, and how she had walked out of that job 8 months later and convinced herself for 2 years that she had left by choice. She thought about the man at the head of that table who had looked at her briefly, with an expression she hadn't been able to read, and then moved the meeting forward, who had gone back to his office and told his legal team to implement the safeguards she'd recommended. Quietly, without credit, who had been in his office at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night when a wrong number arrived and had read it and decided to stay, she thought. He heard me then, and he's saying so now, in front of cameras, on the record, publicly, permanently, irreversibly. By 2 p.m., the first outlet had published a retraction. By 3 p.m., all three had. By 4 p.m., Detective Robert Johnson's phone had received 14 calls from a federal number. Paul, according to his assistant, who had worked for him for 3 years, and who would later give a detailed account of that afternoon to investigators, watched the press conference on his office monitor with an expression that had no available name, like a man watching something he had built very carefully fall in exactly the direction he had calculated it wouldn't fall. Adeline watched it from her office and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite victory, and was, in the end, simply the sensation of a trap opening, the sprung tension of something that had been holding releasing all at once. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed her laptop, straightened the things on her desk, picked up her bag, and went home. The retraction from the third outlet was published at 3:47 p.m. She saw it from her office and sat with it for a moment before she did anything else. She thought about calling Wang So, and then she thought, he knows. He's been watching this since this morning. He knows everything that's happening in real time, and he has been running this alongside whatever else his day contained, which was his quarterly board review and 2 investor calls and a legal filing in 3 jurisdictions, none of which he had canceled or rescheduled. She thought about the specific quality of competence that allowed a person to dismantle someone else's plan and run their own empire simultaneously, and she felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite love, but contained elements of both. The particular regard for someone who moved through the world with the kind of total unhurried purpose she had once had, and had spent 2 years being convinced she never really had at all. He texted at 4:15. It's done. All 3 retractions filed, legal proceedings submitted. Johnson's under federal review as of an hour ago. Go home when you're ready. She read it. She thought about the word home and what it applied to, and she understood that it applied to wherever she chose to go next, and that this was information she had not had in 2 years. She texted back, I'm going to the apartment tonight. A pause then. I know, I'll be close. She closed her laptop. She straightened the things on her desk. The analyst's habit, leave the workspace in order, leave the record complete. She picked up her bag. She went to the window of her office for a moment and looked at the city, which was doing what it always did at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, moving through its afternoon with the indifferent momentum of a thing that did not require her participation to continue. She thought, I am going to walk out of this building and go to the apartment and say the last thing I need to say, and then I'm going to be done. She felt the shape of that, the specific heavy simplicity of a decision that had been a long time coming and was now simply a sequence of steps. She walked out of the building and went to the apartment. She knew he would be there. You could not leave a place you hadn't fully entered. She had been inside this marriage, had accepted its terms, had performed its requirements, had given it enough of herself to make the performance convincing, and she owed it an honest ending rather than a managed disappearance. The apartment was quiet when she came in. Paul was at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He almost never sat at the kitchen table. It was a working surface in his understanding of the space, functional rather than occupying. He had a glass of water in front of him. His phone was on the table, but he was not looking at it, which was the most unsettling she had ever seen him appear, because Paul was always in motion, always managing something, always with a task between himself and the raw fact of sitting in a room without a purpose to perform. He looked like a man who had spent the afternoon in the specific disorientation of watching something he had believed was solid turn out to be hollow, and who had not yet found the framework to account for this in his understanding of how the world worked. He looked at her when she came in. His expression was one she had not seen before, not the controlled, patient calm of a man who believed he had the situation in hand, not the performing warmth of a man who needed her to believe he was reasonable. This was something rawer than that. Something that might have been, in a different man with a different history, the beginning of accountability. In Paul, it was the look of a person who had run out of the particular kind of move he relied on and had not yet decided whether to reach for a different kind. He did not raise his voice. That had never been his method, and it was not his method now. The method did not change simply because the circumstances had, and his most effective register had always been calm. "You know this doesn't change anything," he said. "Whatever happened today, Wang So called a press conference. That's what men like him do when it serves them." He managed this narrative because managing it was useful to him, and when it stops being useful, the narrative changes. He doesn't do things because they're right. He does them because they're strategic. She stood near the door. She did not move toward him, and she did not step back from him. She gave him space to say what he was saying, and she listened to it, not because she needed to hear it, but because she needed to know how much of it still had the old gravity, the old pull, the particular force his voice had always had on her nervous system, the way it had trained her, over 2 years, to doubt her own reading of situations in favor of his. "You're not his equal," Paul said. His voice dropped to the register she recognized as his most precise, not unkind in tone, which was the point, which was always the point. "You never were, and you know it. You're an interesting situation," he solved. "When the situation resolves, so do you. I know how he operates. I've spent 3 months studying him. You've spent 2 months being charmed by him, which isn't the same thing." She looked at him across the kitchen. She looked at the man she had married, the man who had slid a 2-year timeline of incremental theft past her while calling it a life together, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. She did not feel rage. She did not feel the cold satisfaction of victory she had imagined feeling. She felt, mostly, tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has been fighting a thing for a long time that they could only name for the last few months of it, and who is now finally, irrevocably done. She felt underneath the tiredness herself, solid and specific and not moving. She went to the bathroom. She reached behind the door for the bag she had packed 3 days ago. She had packed it on the morning after Wang So said, "I'll find out. Don't let him see you looking." When she had understood that the conversation with Paul was coming, and had wanted to be prepared for it rather than scrambling inside it. One change of clothes, her documents, her passport, retrieved from Paul's filing cabinet a week ago while he was at work, slipped back into her own possession without announcement. The bag was small, deliberately. Not because she was leaving with nothing, but because she was leaving with the right things. And the right things for this night were her documents and her dignity, and the version of herself she had been rebuilding across the past 3 months. She walked back through the apartment with the bag. Paul's eyes went to it immediately. She saw his face register it, register what it meant, register the gap between what he had expected from this evening and what was actually happening. She had expected him to reach for something in that moment. A different argument, a different tone. The wounded version that had worked before, the cold version that had worked before. He reached for neither. He was still sitting at the kitchen table, still and oddly diminished in a way she had never seen him be. And she understood that Wang So's press conference had done something his plan had not. accounted for, it had removed the system Paul had been operating through. Without Johnson's, without the legal threat, without the narrative he had manufactured, and that had been publicly dismantled before the day was out, he had only the voice. And the voice, without the system behind it, was just a voice. She stood at the front door with her hand on the frame. "You drained my account," she said. She said it clearly, with the particular steadiness she had always brought to saying things that were true and difficult, and did not require embellishment to land. $34,000 across 14 months. I have the full transaction history. Wang So's legal team has the transaction history. The fraud investigators who will call you tomorrow morning have the transaction history. She paused for exactly long enough to let that settle. "I know exactly what you did. So does everyone else now." He said something. She heard the words and understood that they were the last version of the argument. The one that came out when all other versions had failed. The one that was less about persuading her and more about maintaining for his own benefit the fiction that he had not lost completely. She had walked out the door before the sentence finished. She did not turn back. The hallway was quiet and fluorescent and entirely ordinary. She had walked this hallway every day for 2 years. She walked it now as herself, with her bag, and she pressed the elevator button and waited, and it came and she stepped in. Wang So's car was at the curb. She had not called ahead. She had texted him 3 days ago when she packed the bag. "I'm nearly ready." And he had said, "I'll be close," and had not asked for anything more than that. He had understood that the timing was hers to determine, and had stationed himself at the distance that let him be present without pushing, available without presuming, which was the thing she had needed from the beginning, and the thing he had understood from the beginning without being told. Steve was in the passenger seat. She saw him through the window when she came through the building's front door, and something in her chest released. The specific relief of seeing a person who loved you accurately, who had known what was happening before you could tell him, who had come because he understood that this night required him to be here without being asked. She got in the back. The car pulled into the street. She looked out the window at the building receding behind them and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific lightness of a person who has set down something heavy enough that they had forgotten it had weight. Not triumphant, just lighter, just more herself than she had been when she went in. Paul reached for his phone. He called Robert Johnson 4 times that night. Johnson did not answer any of them. The legal proceedings moved the way. Legal proceedings moved when they had been thoroughly prepared by people who knew exactly what they were doing, efficiently and without mercy for the thing being dismantled. Paul was arrested on financial fraud charges 12 days after the press conference. The case was built on documentation so complete, the shell account records, the transaction history, the IP chain that connected the financial theft to the media fabrication, all of it forensically assembled and filed in 3 jurisdictions, that his attorney's first meeting with him lasted 40 minutes and ended with a frank assessment of options that did not include trial. Johnson was placed on administrative leave pending federal review, a designation that, in the understanding of people who worked in that building, was a formality preceding a conclusion that had already been reached. The fabricated case against Adeline collapsed so completely that locating any trace of it in the record required active effort. Wang So's legal team initiated civil recovery proceedings for the drained account and attached Paul's accessible assets to the claim immediately, which meant the $38,000 was returned within 60 days from a source that had considerably more than enough to cover it. Her immigration status was cleared in a 20-minute meeting. The fabricated case was formally struck from any record that might have followed her. She stayed with Steve for the first 2 weeks. He lived in a part of the city she had stopped knowing during the marriage. She had a specific memory, arriving at his building with the small bag, of looking at his neighborhood and recognizing how far she had been pulled from the ordinary geography of her own life. How many places she had gradually stopped going. How many streets she had simply stopped walking because at some point she had stopped having the kind of time that belonged to her rather than to the management of a household, a marriage, a performance of contentment. She walked those 2 weeks with the intention of someone reclaiming ground. She walked streets she hadn't walked in 2 years, went back to the Pojang matcha in the Insadong alley, sat at the plastic stool, and ordered tteokbokki and ate it slowly and let the city be around her, without managing her presence in it. The elderly woman behind the cart looked at her the same way she had looked at her 6 months ago, the comfortable indifference of someone who had been feeding people for 50 years, and found them all more or less equivalent in their hunger. Adeline appreciated it enormously. There was a specific relief in being treated as ordinary by someone who had no knowledge of anything extraordinary that had happened to you. She slept well. She had not been sleeping well for 2 years and had not known it was something to miss until she started doing it again. Wang So did not push. He texted. He called twice, once to tell her the proceedings were progressing as expected, once to ask if she needed anything. She said no to the second call, then thought about it for a minute and called him back. She said, "Stop asking if I need anything. Tell me how you are." He was quiet for a moment, the pause she had learned to recognize as genuine consideration, rather than performance of it. Then he said, "I'm better than I was," she said. "So am I." That was enough for both of them. The first time the three of them were in the same room, her, Wang So, Steve. She had arranged it on a Saturday morning, a cafe in Steve's neighborhood, the city at its most ordinary. She had been mildly anxious in the specific way she was anxious about things that mattered, which was not afraid but aware that the meeting would tell her something. Wang So arrived first. She watched from the doorway as Steve registered who the man at the table was, and as Wang So registered Steve, and she watched the 4 or 5 seconds of quiet mutual calibration that happened between two people who had spoken on the phone and were now establishing whether their understanding of each other held. It held. She could see it happen. The specific ease that arrived when two people's assessments of a third person were close enough to trust each other's judgment. They talked about her for a few minutes, briefly and without pretense, and then they talked about other things. Steve asked Wang So about Southeast Asian market conditions relevant to a client of his. Wang So answered with the specificity of someone who found the question genuinely interesting. She sat between them and ate her coffee cake and felt, for the first time in a very long time, surrounded by people who saw her accurately and were glad of what they saw. She noticed that neither of them made the conversation about themselves. She decided this meant something. A month after she'd walked out of the apartment with a small bag, she took a meeting at WSK Group. She had requested it herself. That felt important to say clearly to herself and to anyone who might ask. Not as Wang So's girlfriend, not as the woman whose situation had been the subject of a press conference, as an independent financial consultant with a specific proposal and a methodology she had been developing across the weeks of her recovery. The work that had always been best in her, the work that required finding the truth the data was trying to tell, and saying it regardless of whether the room wanted to hear it. She walked into the WSK Group building on a Tuesday morning in the structured blazer that had now been worn enough times that it had stopped feeling like armor and started feeling like hers. She went into a conference room with 6 people she had never met, and she presented. She talked with her hands. She did not look at the glass wall of the conference room, though she was aware of it. When she came out, Wang So was standing in the corridor with 2 cups of coffee. He was wearing the dark suit and the open collar, and he was smiling in the way she had seen him smile only a few times, the kind that arrived slightly ahead of his awareness that he was doing it, the unself-conscious kind, the kind produced by something he hadn't planned for and was glad of. "How did it go?" he said. "They're going to make an offer," she said. "I'm going to negotiate." He handed her one of the coffees. Good. They stood in the corridor for a moment, holding their cups, and she thought about the distance traveled to be standing here. The wrong number, the rain, the 2 months of midnight texts, the cafe and the blazer, and the name and the balance on the screen and the bag behind the bathroom door. She thought about all of it, and none of it felt like loss. It felt like the price of arrival, the thing you paid to get from where you were to where you were going, and the getting there being worth it. That night late, she was in his office. She had come to finish a piece of analysis. He had given her access to a workstation in the corner 3 weeks ago, and she used it sometimes in the evenings when she wanted to work, and her own temporary apartment still had the quality of something she hadn't fully settled into yet. The office was familiar to her now, in the way that places became familiar when you had spent enough good hours in them. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the end tower burning blue in the middle distance. The city spread out in every direction, alive with its own business, indifferent and enormous and entirely its own. She finished what she was working on and pushed back from the workstation and went to the window. She stood there for a while. She thought about the last time she had stood at a window in this city looking out. 2:47 in the morning, in a car in the rain, watching the apartment building she couldn't make herself re-enter, watching the city that had seemed too big and too indifferent to care whether she existed in it. She thought about how different the same city looked from here. Not because the view was higher, though it was. Because she was different in it. Because she was standing at the window rather than sitting in the car, and the difference was not about the altitude, but about who she was in, relation to everything she could see. She heard him come to stand beside her. He moved the way he always moved, without announcement, without the performance of arrival. But she knew his presence the way she had learned to know it, across the months of close attention they had paid each other, the specific quality of the air when he was in it. They stood without speaking for a moment. The city below them kept doing what it did. The taxis, the late-night restaurants, the particular glow of soul at midnight that she had once sat in a car watching and felt entirely outside of. "This is what you see every night," she said. "It looks different now," he said. She understood what he meant, and it was not about the view. It was about who was beside him in it, about the fact that this office, which had been the particular architecture of his solitude for longer than she'd known him, now had her in it, and the window they were looking at together was not the window it had been when he stood at it alone. Things changed when you were not alone in them, even things that hadn't moved. Her phone buzzed against the workstation desk across the room. She didn't move toward it immediately. She stayed at the window for another moment, looking at the city that had contained all of it. The car, the rain, the wrong number, the man beside her now, the months of building something she hadn't had a name for until she was inside it. Then she crossed the room and looked at the screen. Her sister, finally calling back. 3 weeks and 2 days after Adeline had sat in a car in the rain and tried to reach her. 3 weeks and 2 days after the message failed and landed somewhere else entirely and changed everything. She looked at the call. She thought about picking it up. She thought about what her sister's voice would sound like, and what she would say, and how she would explain the past months in a way that was honest without being overwhelming, the kind of conversation that would take more than one phone call, and that she was finally, genuinely ready to have. She owed her sister the true version of events. She would give it to her. Tomorrow or this week, or whenever the right time was, there would be a right time and she would use it. But tonight was this. The window, the city, the man beside her who had answered a text meant for someone else and had stayed. She set the phone face down on the desk. She went back to the window. They stood there together, and soul kept going below them the way it always had. Beautiful, enormous, entirely its own, and for the first time in a long time, Adeline Carlson kept going too, not surviving, not managing, not performing the version of herself that fit inside someone else's requirements. Just going in the direction she had chosen, with her eyes open and her hands her own. Outside the window, the city glittered on, and so did she. She thought, standing there, about the version of this night that had almost happened instead. The version where she had sat in her office and seen the 3 retractions and felt relief without understanding, or felt relief and done nothing with it, or found a way to absorb the outcome of the day into the existing shape of her life and continue as she had been continuing. She could have done that. People did that. absorbed evidence, and kept going in the same direction. Because direction was comfortable, and changing it required something she had not been sure she had. She had it. She had known she had it from the moment she had looked at the $200 on the screen and felt clarity instead of despair. From the moment she had called Steve and told him everything without the edited version. From the moment she had typed to Wang So, "I need to know what he knows before he builds something out of it that I can't correct." She had been building herself back for longer than she'd acknowledged, assembling the version of Adeline Carlson that had always existed underneath. The 2 years of managed disappearance, and the wrong number had not created that version. It had simply opened a space where she could remember it. Wang So stood beside her at the window, and she thought about what he had said to Steve on the phone. The question he had asked, does she need to be saved, or does she need a door held open? She thought about the precision of that question, about the understanding it demonstrated, that there was a difference between a person who needed rescue and a person who needed space, and that confusing the two was its own kind of damage, and that he had understood which one she was from the beginning without her having to tell him. She thought, I sent the text to the wrong number, and it reached exactly the right one. The city stretched out below them, Seoul at midnight, all its light and noise and indifferent enormity, and she stood at the window and let herself be exactly where she was. Not managing it, not measuring it, not translating it into something more or less than what it was. She was standing at a window in the city she had made her own, beside a man who had held a door open without being asked, and she was going to negotiate a contract with his company next week, and her brother was coming for dinner on Sunday, and her sister's call was sitting on the desk waiting for the right time, and the right time was coming and she was ready for it. She understood, no longer waiting. She was simply living in the direction she had chosen, with her eyes open and her hands entirely her own.